From missing teenagers to slain soldiers, we count down the 8 terrifying real hitchhiker stories. Number 8. Connie Smith. In the summer of 1952, Connie Smith, a 10-year-old girl, was spending the summer at Camp Sloan in Connecticut. One morning, she had a fight with a few of the other campers and ended up with a bloody nose. She told camp counselors she was just going to return an ice pack, but she ended up leaving the camp altogether. Witnesses seen Connie asking for directions to a nearby town called Lakesville, and that was the last time she was seen alive. Connie's grandfather organized a missing persons campaign, but there was no trace of her anywhere. 6 years later, some hunters in Arizona found the remains of an unknown girl who was named Little Miss X. In 1962, an anonymous letter was sent to the Connecticut State Police Office that stated that Little Miss X was the body of Connie Smith. Specialists conducted DNA tests, but the results were inconclusive, and the disappearance of Connie Smith still remains a mystery to this day. Number 7. Amy Billing. Amy Billing was a 17-year-old who spent a lot of time hitchhiking through the Miami region. One spring afternoon in 1974, she left her house to hitchhike to her dad's work, but she never turned up. Amy's parents, especially her mother, spent years trying to find out what happened to their daughter. On her search, she met a biker named Paul Branch, who told her that Amy was kidnapped by a biker gang, the Pagans. Branch passed away in 1997, and on his deathbed, he claimed that Amy overdosed the day she disappeared at a party the Pagans held. He also said that the biker gang didn't know what to do with the girl's body, so they threw her into the Everglades and fed her to alligators. For over 2 decades, Amy's mother was the victim of harassing phone calls by a man named Henry Blair. He told her that Amy was still alive and was being held in a sex slave ring. He was finally arrested in 1995 but denied knowing anything about the disappearance of Amy. Tragically, Amy's mother, Suzanne Billing, died in 2005 before ever knowing what really happened to her daughter. Number 6. Colleen Stan. Back in 1977, 21-year-old Colleen Stan was hitchhiking and got into a car with a man named Cameron Hooker because she thought it would be safe considering his wife and baby were also in the vehicle. Hooker drove to an abandoned area and pulled over and put a knife to Colleen's throat. His wife Janice had told Cameron to kidnap Colleen so she wouldn't have to be part of her husband's bondage fantasies anymore. Colleen was forced for years to endure brutal conditions. She was beaten, fed scraps, sexually abused and tortured. She was locked in a small box beneath Cameron and Janice's bed for 23 hours a day and only given a tiny bedpan to relieve herself of body fluids. In the summer months, the small box she was locked in reached temperatures of 100 degrees and more. Cameron broke Colleen down not only physically but also psychologically by telling her that she was being watched by an organization called The Company. He told her that if she tried to escape that they would torture her even worse than what he did to her. She was given a slave name and wasn't allowed to speak unless he gave her permission. The door to the box she was in was left open often, but because she suffered from Stockholm Syndrome, she never tried to escape. After 7 long years of being held captive, in 1984, Janice helped Colleen escape. She asked Colleen not to tell anybody about what had been done to her because she thought she could rehabilitate her husband through faith and church. Colleen agreed and didn't tell anyone. Years had passed and Janice finally came to the conclusion that there was no helping her husband, and she told her church pastor about everything that Cameron had done. In 2009, over 30 years later, Colleen wrote a tell-all book that described everything she went through and what she had learned from her terrible ordeal. Number 5. The Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Murders. Between 1972 and 1973 in the North Bay area of California, there were 7 unsolved homicides that involved female hitchhikers. The bodies of 7 victims were found naked and in a nearby creek. An 8th hitchhiker vanished, but her body was never found. The victims' ages ranged from 12 years to 19, and they were found dead with broken necks, hog-tied and raped. The killers were never found, and some people in the area still believe that it was the Zodiac Killer or Ted Bundy who committed these murders. Number 4. Marty Shook. One day in 1982, a young man named Marty Shook left home in Nevada to hitchhike all the way to Colorado. 2 days later, Shook's naked body was found by a fisherman in Utah. His genitals were removed but were never found, and he was killed with a .38 pistol with a shot to the back of the head. The case went cold for 5 years until police connected his murder with that of another hitchhiker named Wayne Reifendiefer. Wayne's body was found in a wooded area close to Williamsburg, Pennsylvania. He was also shot in the back of the head by the same type of gun and castrated. Soon after Wayne's body was found, another body turned up in Lynchfield, Connecticut. Although the cause of death wasn't determined, the body had also been mutilated. Both his genitals and nipples were removed, and his legs were severed at mid-thigh. Authorities believe that all 3 murders were by the same person, but the case is still unsolved. Number 3. Philip Frazier. Back in 1988, a young man by the name of Philip Frazier was planning on attending Evergreen State College in Washington. He left Alaska in the middle of June to drive down to Washington to finish enrolling in the school. In order to get into the university, he needed to cross the Canadian border. 4 days had passed since he left for this trip, and he stopped at a cafe in British Columbia where he met a hitchhiker who asked Philip for a ride. Witnesses at the cafe said that Philip at first refused to give the hitchhiker a ride, but then he must have had a change of heart because he drove off with the unknown man. Philip Frazier was never seen alive again. A month later, his body was found in a gravel pit in Stewart, British Columbia. Witnesses came forward and said they came across a man that matched the hitchhiker's description about 8 hours after Frazier was seen in the cafe. The couple said that the hitchhiker stayed at their home overnight and had taken over the identity of Philip Frazier. Philip's car was set on fire and found shortly after in Prince George at a car wash. It's been nearly 30 years and the identity of the hitchhiker is still a mystery. Number 2. Patrick Dubois. Throughout the 80s, the Marne region in France was known as the Triangle of Death. A number of soldiers from 3 different military garrisons went missing while most of them were hitchhiking. A 19-year-old named Patrick Dubois was from the 4th Dragons Regiment, and he was the first victim that disappeared. 7 more men disappeared in the region over the next 7 years. Out of all the victims, only 1 body was actually found. A year later, after the last disappearance, authorities believed a former warrant officer of the 4th Dragons named Pierre Chantel was behind the murders. One day, a police patron stumbled upon Chantel's van and discovered he was videotaping the torture and rape of a young hitchhiker that he had kidnapped. Chanel was sentenced to 10 years for that crime, and he was let out of prison in 1995 after DNA testing had been conducted on his van. Traces of evidence that matched 3 of the missing victims were found. Chanel was finally charged with 3 murders in 2001. However, he didn't serve much time because he committed suicide in the prison hospital. Number 1. The Prendergast Murders. In November 1958, Thomas Prendergast picked up a teenage hitchhiker named Carl Alfred Eddar. Carl told Thomas that he was homeless, and feeling sorry for the young man, Prendergast invited him to stay with him and his family until he got back on his feet. About a month later, Thomas was on his way back home when he noticed that Carl was hitchhiking for a ride to San Diego. Thomas decided to give him a ride to a service station and then returned home, but when he walked into his house, he discovered a horrifying scene. His wife was shot dead and his 4 children aged 2, 4, 6, and 9 had all been killed with a hunting knife. Carl Eddar was caught 2 days later and he admitted that he snapped because the 2-year-old was screaming. So he threw her down on the ground and shot Mrs. Prendergast and then murdered the 2 youngest kids. The older children returned home from school shortly after, and then he killed them all as well. Eddar was sentenced to 2 life sentences, but in 1974 he escaped and he is still on the run. Through the years, Eddar has been seen with biker gangs, but some people believe one of the gangs murdered him. Today, he would be in his 70s if he is still alive, and there is still a $20,000 reward on his head.